Hi, folks. My discussion this evening that I want to have is all about authority and something that I think affects us all. And it's a really important issue. We're all affected by authority figures' choices in their lives when they have influence over us. That can be a variety of different authority figures, from could be your parents, of course, as we all have, or people acting as parents, carers, or guardians, people that have a legal right to make decisions and that have consequences on our lives, whether they're good or bad decisions. We all begin life in that situation. Of course, more broadly, there's other authority figures in life, of course. Whether people respect them or recognize them or not, they still can have an influence over what happens within our lives and what our ability to do various things are. Could be manager at work, couldn't it? Could be police, people with a legal authority. Could be judges. Could be prison warden if we're in prison, for example. Could be government ministers and legislators. Could be doctors that are looking after us or giving us advice. It could be all different people, different professionals. Could be a legal representative, representing us in a court of law. So, there's all sorts of situations where either through our choice or through circumstances, we could be faced with having to deal with different kinds of authority figures. So it's really important that we all consider how we relate to, how we deal with different situations, how we relate to authority. I personally feel that a middle path approach, balance in all things is quite sensible. We don't want to idolize anyone in authority and look at people as being godlike and beyond any fair and reasoned criticism. But at the same time, we also don't want to sort of demonize other people and negatively portray them in an unfair light. We want to try and look at things objectively, critically, though, and look at the good and bad that anyone does. But that's true for anyone, but all the more important when it comes to an authority. And it's more important because, obviously, someone in a vested position has an ability to have a greater impact on other people. It has a greater ripple effect. They can do a lot of good and a lot of bad as well. You consider a judge, they can protect the public from someone who may be a very real potential harm to others, or they can impose a sentence that's fair, that may help someone to reform their actions. But at the same time, it's quite possible that they actually may imprison someone who's innocent or impose a sentence that is harsh or too lenient. And that will have effects not just for the victim of those miscarriages of justice, but also for their family, their friends, but actually for wider society, especially if that could happen to anyone. So it's in all our interests, therefore, to try and encourage and look for good standards of conduct, not just in a judicial setting, but more broadly in any authoritarian setting too. That's what we should be wanting and striving to be fair and objective in our criticism. But it also means it's a two-way street, accepting that criticism as well, and being consistent in that. We can't impose laws and standards on other people that we wouldn't accept ourselves. So that's always the golden rule, isn't it? Not to try and impose any kind of regulation or code of conduct on anyone else that we wouldn't want to accept ourselves. So it's always worthwhile sort of considering, when we're being critical of others, and where are we being too harsh or too lenient? Are we making an effort to consider that person's circumstances, the environment in which they're working in, what their abilities are, what their stresses are, Are we actually considering the wider context of how they are behaving and why they are? What could be motivating them? Are we making every effort and taking the energy and time to invest in to properly looking at the situation as justly as possible? Rushed verdicts make bad judgments, of course, but at the same time, one doesn't want to be too agnostic and sit on the fence when there is sufficient evidence to actually make a call, and it's important to do so. So always have to try and make a balanced sort of reasoned decision. That can be difficult for all of us. Before I go too deeply into sort of different types of authority and how they can affect us, and how we have to all consider our own behaviour and how we relate to different positions, I first want to ask a more simple, a more basic question of what is an authority to begin with. I think children have a tendency to ask some of the most simple questions. In fact, oftentimes it's things that we as adults assume that we already know the answer to, things that are beyond questioning perhaps. And I think actually if we stop to sometimes question some of the more basic assumptions that we have, actually I think sometimes it can be an interesting avenue for exploring and seeing whether our assumptions are justifiable or not. Like I gave examples early on of more obvious types of authority figures. And I'm sure if you had a questionnaire given to many adults, they'd probably come up with a similar list off the top of their heads. Parental figures, police, judges, probation officers, perhaps, government ministers, doctors. They might go on and say colonels, military figures. They might say religious figures, perhaps as well. Your local minister could be a preacher, could be an imam, a rabbi, a priest, a vicar, depending on your religious persuasion. But of course, an atheist wouldn't look on any of those as authority figures, perhaps only an authority on their own delusion, perhaps. So what we believe an authority figure to be or not can sometimes depend on who we are and what our own beliefs are. Somebody that might be very much considered an authority for some, might in fact be considered quite irrelevant, irrational, and only an authority in their own delusions by others. So there may be figures that are contested as to whether they are an accepted and legitimate authority figure or not. I gave the example there of some authorities in religious fields that would obviously be accepted from some sectarian religious points of view, but clearly not by many other outsider believers. And so we need to consider whether or not somebody is legitimate in their position of authority. But of course, if I was living in a theocracy under a religious government, for example, whether I agreed with their position or not, I might still be held accountable to them. I might still be influenced, and there might be still laws that are legally enforceable that I might have to be held accountable to, whether I agree with them or not. I might not agree with all of the legislation in the law of a country I live in. I don't. I agree with some things and not with other things. Nevertheless, when I was summoned to a court for the crime of growing cannabis plants in my garden, I felt I had to go, and I felt like if I didn't go, then there would be a warrant for my arrest, there would be consequences, and I could be taken to court for that. I could be in violation of more laws. So I thought it was in the best interest for myself to go along. I might not have accepted and agreed with the verdict, but nevertheless, when the magistrate found me guilty of the offence of production of a Class B drug, I abided with the decision. It seemed the most practical thing to do, and paid my fine. And I suppose I felt glad at least that that I wasn't punished in a more severe fashion, as some people have been at least. And I didn't think a small fine was such a big deal to get too worked up about, at least. I didn't agree with the verdicts, but I agreed that it made the most logical choice at the time to respect the magistrate's authority, even if I didn't agree with what that verdict was. But that was my decision at that time. It was a sort of, and we all have different choices, when we perhaps will be summoned to a court for something we may disagree with, and we have to make a choice whether we submit, how we choose to do that, and that is oftentimes a choice through circumstances where you're forced to make that choice. You may be doing something that you believe is quite ethical and doesn't have any victim and isn't a crime, but nevertheless you may be in a position where you are called to make a judgment call yourself, and how you interact and how you relate to authority. We all can be in various positions where we have to. Going back to that more basic question of what is an authority figure, because it's often assumed, and I must admit the official accepted legitimate authority figures that I first conjured up in my mind, what first came to my mind, I suppose, are people that tend to be looked up to and admired, and that popularly will be given a lot of attention. People will consider them to be fairly qualified experts within that field of study. There might be scientists that have academic credentials, that have worked for many years in careers, and so we might consider them to have the right qualifications. But actually, what I was thinking earlier was, people can have an authority in something that isn't necessarily recognised more generally. And I was thinking of the case of people that are homeless, oddly enough, rough sleepers. I went through a time of being homeless for, I don't know, a couple of months, 6 or 7 weeks, in fact, when I was on the streets. It was a hard time in my life. But what I found was that some of the people that were able to help me during that, there were a few people, thankfully, that gave me some handouts. I was able to buy food, but other rough sleepers, long-term rough sleepers, actually were able to help me a lot. When I was staying in certain cities, they knew where the safer places to stay were. They had various blankets, although they were a bit moth-eaten and raggedy, but better than nothing on a cold winter's night, stashed behind different bushes. They know where food was given out. They knew what to say to other people to get money. They knew which bins were locked and which ones were open in order to go and get various foods thrown away. They knew a various amount of things to help survive on the streets. Some of them have spent many months, even years, in fact, surviving in such situations. And so I was then in a situation where the authority and the expert I needed to help me get through that wasn't someone that would have been typically considered an authority figure. It's not someone you would have, straight away would have come to your mind, actually. But in that situation, when I was homeless for that time, somebody that was a rough sleeper, that knew how to survive and had the experience of doing that, they suddenly, in that situation for me, were qualified, to help guide me through. And, to be honest with you, if it wasn't for the help and support of a few of the rough sleepers I found, not saying they were all like that, there were a few drunk, that didn't make as much sense and, or weren't as interested in helping me. But there were some others that actually were very approachable, and I really owe my life perhaps to some of them, because they were bitter cold nights. They helped me get through some of those. And I actually think if you look at different situations in life, people that you wouldn't ordinarily assume were authorities can become that, depending on the specific situation you're in. Imagine if you're a victim of abuse, for example. Who's an authority on how to cope with severe abuse, and to learn coping strategies to get through a difficult situation like that? A former victim of abuse that's been through it, that's had the direct experience of that, they are the authority and experienced person to deal with that and to help counsel you through those things. So it depends, on a situation that you're in. Specific different situations require us then to recognise different authority figures who may not be officially recognised in other capacities in life. It depends very much on what that particular situation is in life. But we still have to be cautious about who we accept as an authority on a specific situation and why, and is it legitimate that we accept them, and consider what our motivations for that is. Is that down perhaps sometimes to our own biases, our own prejudices, because they think like us? We do sometimes all have a tendency to sort of want to go and listen to other people that will echo our own beliefs and merely just confirm or conform to the things that we ourselves believe. And I think that what we've got to be able to do in order to debate things more sensibly and from a more open-minded position is to try and listen to people with a wide variety of different kinds of beliefs. Because it's all too tempting when we have a really strongly held belief in something just to want to listen to others that echo those beliefs of our own. That's true of people in religions. You tend to find that, but also true for different ideological standpoints also. While we shy away and avoid talking to others that will contradict our own beliefs, but how can we criticize and understand what those beliefs are if we're not exposed to them, if we're not really well acquainted with them? We can't sufficiently understand what they are, and if we don't, then we can't really either accept them or reject them in a fair way. So we need to be able to listen to different beliefs that will contradict our own beliefs. The truth the truth, if it is that, would welcome any kind of fair questioning. If it is that, only the lie is really afraid to be exposed. But in actual fact, we may actually carry some beliefs that are wrong. We will do, necessarily. We have so many different kinds of beliefs, and I think most of our experiences are that sometimes we find out something that we've believed for many years, perhaps even decades, turned out to be wrong. Someone that we thought was honest wasn't. Some information we thought was genuine, was wrong. We may be quite well-intentioned, in fact, and we may find out something we thought and we held on to dearly actually turned out to be wrong. So we've got to be willing to actually amend and change those beliefs, to erase the wrong things that we've drawn on our cognitive maps and put new information when new information comes to light. We don't want to be holding on to old beliefs that turn out to be wrong when new evidence surfaces, just because, we don't want to admit that we could have been wrong for so long. And that's really hard for any of us, because that means admitting that we may have misled other people, even if we've done it through good intention, and that's awful. But, I know that I've given people advice to the best of my knowledge in the past. I generally don't, be deceptive,